Good afternoon. Welcome to today's ACP webinar series presentation entitled Blast and Flood Zones, Terrorism, and Distributed Denial of Service Attacks, New Elements of a Comprehensive Disaster Recovery Plan. I'm Michelle Lowther with Continuity Housing, where we provide housing for critical personnel when you need it most. These days, a DR plan must account for many contingencies and new threats, well beyond just backup. Today, we're going to learn how to build a better plan by examining geography, cyber attack trends and potential targets, and the role a hybrid cloud can play in mitigating many of these threats. Specifically, you'll learn these four things. 1, how to access and interpret federal geographic data. 2, how and why businesses are including terrorism in their DR plans. 3, top 5 DR plan mistakes. And 4, the specifics around how one coastal Massachusetts-based healthcare provider selected their recovery site. There will be a few places today where we stop to answer questions. One will be midway through the presentation and then again another at the end. And as you think of questions that you'd like to ask of our presenter, just send them to us using the chat feature on your GoToWebinar control panel. So speaking of today's presenter, Christian Lappin is Director, Sales Engineering at TierPoint. Christian frequently speaks about using cloud technology to help organizations better protect and manage their data assets. Additionally, he serves as an active member of the FBI InfraGard Task Force and the American Red Cross's Disaster Services Team. Christian has more than 15 years of infrastructure experience, and he's both an informative and entertaining presenter, occasionally even breaking out his skills as a professional magician. Good afternoon, Christian. Thanks so much for joining us today.
And thank you so much for having me. Today we have a lot of really good information that I'm looking forward to sharing with you guys today, especially some new information that I've actually been able to obtain just this morning. So one of the important things to think about when looking at disaster recovery as a whole is there are quite a few new threats. And one of the things that's really happening to a lot of specific organizations is that they have to do more with less money. And they are now seeing a huge shift in the once 24 to 48 hour RPO, and being pushed to do more in a shorter amount of time. Also, one of the things too that's really started to become front and center is it's really become more about protecting the business and more about trying to protect the overall brand. In terms of actual security and compliancy, those are important trends that need to be maintained in order to appropriately manage ongoing operations. So obviously disasters take many forms. If we were all attending this presentation a few years ago, these I would say would be the top 3 threats, you know, that everybody's looking to try and actively protect themselves against, right? Hurricane, fire, flood. In addition to that, 80% of most actual disasters are prone from hardware, you know, equipment failure, human error, viruses, data loss, things like that. In terms of actual technology too, the advancements in technology have made it significantly easier for more environments to come under attack. One very interesting statistic is that you would probably be surprised to learn that more than 90% of corporations out there have all suffered some form of computer and or security breach within the last 10 years. Now, the reason that number is so high is because a lot of these specific data breaches go unnoticed. And 2 sort of key points that are, I guess if you will, enabling that would be bring your own device and bring your own computer. Less than 40% of organizations out there today have a formal BYOD policy. And by not having that in place, you're really just, basically asking for trouble, because those devices then become the perfect attack vector, for hackers who are looking to, specifically gain access into your corporate network. Obviously, once inside the network, they can sit dormant, for up to, say for example, 200+ days before exploiting the system. Especially now with a lot of the distributed denial of service attacks, that are occurring out there, is that there's a high volume of, botnets and things like that, that are existing out there within a lot of people's networks that are really causing a lot of high-value breach. In fact, more than 45% of all software that is actually actively used by organizations today are actually in the cloud. Out of that 45%, only 22% of them are actively visible, to IT. So a lot of you would, I'm sure, be surprised to discover shadow IT operations that are existing inside of your environment. In fact, if you look at the average, enterprise, they have more than 400 cloud applications, including on average about 47 apps, just for marketing, and 27 cloud storage apps. So within every kind of organization, you have a lot of applications that are being used that might not be fully authorized. So, flooding update today, as I'm sure a lot of our friends can attest to, in Texas, there's a lot of water going on today. Some really interesting points. So, more than 37 counties under an active emergency declaration. This has also been the first ever flash flood emergency put out there for Houston. Full suspension of all rail and bus services, and over 88,000 customers lost power. So as you can see here in the photos, a lot of power loss, a lot of water gain, and a lot of flooding in a very short amount of time. This also brings up a very important point about multifaceted disasters. A lot of people will plan for specific events. So actually, if I go back here, flood, fire, and hurricane, singular events. But what's important to actively understand is that, for example, with a flood, you can have the widespread power outages, but then you also have, as you can see here on Interstate 45, widespread, transportational issues. So for a lot of those folks that are slowly starting to transition away from physical seats and suites, and your more traditional forms of business continuity, the ability for folks, to work from home, or more importantly, to be able to actually get to the data center or to the disaster recovery center can become, significantly challenging. So that's why it's always important to plan, and that's also why looking at things like cloud are so important, because obviously cloud is going to enable you to have additional options. For example, here in Boston with the Boston bomber, the city had power, but during the manhunt, the entire city was on lockdown. So, that, specific situations, you had, split organizations of folks that were there at work, and then folks that were, unable to get to work. So, it became incredibly difficult for folks to have that, specific business continuity planning. So that's why it's very, very, very important to have, contingency planning in place for multifaceted disasters. A few years ago, up in New England as well, we had that huge freeze, with all the snowstorm actually around Halloween. We had the big ice storm. That caused widespread power outage, but it also closed a lot of roads. So you saw the same situation that you're actively seeing in Texas, where folks tried to travel, but they weren't able to travel. Next, we move into the domestic terrorism issues. These are things that are occurring around the world that we're now starting to see smaller subset of these events here at home. Obviously, these are things that you can't necessarily specifically plan for, but these are things that you definitely need to be made aware of. Soft targets, for example. One of the first, probably main questions that I get asked a lot by organizations is, what do these threats specifically have to do with my business, or more importantly, me personally? So when evaluating soft targets, those are targets of opportunity, such as your shopping malls, hospitals, certain businesses, that are basically open, to the public. The act of terrorism isn't necessarily an act against that specific business. It could also be looked at as a specific act of, opportunity. So it's important to look at not only your systems, but also the overall perimeter of the environment to make sure that you have everything hardened as well as possible. Next, we start to look at drones. We've seen a lot about drones in the news. There's a lot of things that have been enhanced for a drone, primarily weight. You can now fairly easily get approximately 250 pounds onto a drone now. So obviously that allows you to, as you can see on the slide, surveillance, mounted weapon, specific disruptions against, aircraft. And one of the things that we're actually seeing in our border states is the widespread use of drones to actually send things across borders and in and out of secure sites. So it's important, to be aware of the actual capabilities and to be aware of not only the perimeter, but also the space of air that exists above your site. In terms of the actual fighters too, we have a lot of foreign fighters that are basically coming home from Syria and also from Iraq. Primarily, they're funneling back into the United States through Canada and through Mexico. More than 2 million fighters are actively calling the United States home. So obviously that's a problem. So it's important, to be aware that, things that you're seeing on the news aren't at home, but a lot of these fighters are starting, to return home. And we have more magazines. So the terrorists have been able to become better marketers. They have a lot of new documentation out, primarily the Inspire magazine. This was, the same magazine that was actually used by the Boston bombers for their recipe for the actual pressure cooker bombers. And this was also the same magazine that they put out a more enhanced recipe, if you will, improving upon what they had out there back in 2010 for the Times Square bomber. So if you look at that device in comparison to what's available now, if the Times Square device had successfully detonated, at worst, he would have split his car in two. I mean, obviously that's bad, but in terms of what's available today, the new threat and really what's going on are VBIEDs. And as you can see over here on the right, that was actually a test detonation done by Homeland Security. A device such as that, as you can see, over 1,000 pounds equivalent, to TNT, 400 feet building standoff distance. That means if you're inside of a building away from windows and inside of a structure, you would need to be at minimal distance, 400 feet away from a van, or if you're outside, as you can see, 2,400 feet. So obviously, as we know, actual football field's only 120 yards or 360 feet. So more than 6 football fields of, potential debris. Through technology, Google Earth allows the terrorists to do their specific, reconnaissance. So very recently, I gave a talk in Plymouth at the Sheraton Portsmouth Harborside Hotel, which you could see there on the map. That was not obtained from a drone. That was just obtained from Google Earth. And as you can see here in the actual courtyard, you could do a lot of reconnaissance and a lot of scanning. The street view also allows you, to zoom down obviously to street level, and for both, businesses and homes, allows you to see, doors, windows, ingress, egress. So for a placement of a device such as this, Google Earth makes it incredibly simple to actually do that. So it's important for you to also utilize these same tools, to take a look at places you frequent, and most importantly, your actual business. Now, I also included this chart here for a comparison contrast. So in the prior example, we were really looking at right here, SUV van, so again, as you can see, the appropriate standoff distances in comparison to, say, for example, a semi-trailer. So it's, paramount to think about placement of your devices, your hardware, people, data center, infrastructure inside of buildings to ensure that this is not a risk, or if it is a risk, that you're appropriately able to mitigate a lot of that threat. Flooding. Again, the example that I used was, Portsmouth, New Hampshire, because as you can see, it's surrounded by water on all sides. And the place that I spoke at was pretty much at the tip of that with exposure to a lot of water. So obviously, if you have a production facility in proximity to water, and that's your only site, I certainly hope you have a boat because you're going to need it. So obviously, common sense here, you want to make sure that you have at least at minimal, depending upon your specific RTO, RPO, a backup that is going to be significantly inland or away from your production site. As an example, if you look within the healthcare vertical, meaningful use is really hot right now. There's a big push to gain compliancy for a lot of those systems and a lot of that specific infrastructure, so that way they can obtain federal funding. So what a lot of sites are doing is, if their production site is in a high risk or semi-high risk environment, often what's occurring is they're moving that out of region and then perhaps making their production site DR. So again, it's important to understand the specific tools that are available. FEMA has a lot of really good resources. Obviously, with Sandy, Irene, so on and so forth, the flood maps change frequently. So if you had checked a year ago, obviously make sure that you're up to date with all of that. Okay, now we've reached a point in which I want to kind of see if you guys have any questions about anything we covered, if you'd like some more information. So please take this time to type the question into your question box, and we'll be happy to address that right now for you.
We have been getting a couple actually. I've got one, yes, that I can open with. And yes, if there's anything you guys want to hear more about, please send it through us, or to us, excuse me, through the chat feature. This one says our headquarters and other facilities are all outside of major metropolitan areas. The question is, how do I convince our board that we still need to be prepared for the results of a terror attack?
Excellent question. So one of the things that you need to really look at and really focus on is that even though your specific company might not be a direct target, you want to look at the surrounding area. You want to look at the resources that are around. So for example, if you're in a external site way outside of the city, an attack on the specific power infrastructure, food, things like that could actually cause a more widespread risk. So you always want to look at your specific community, and then what supports the community, and then think what would happen if those community resources like food, water, power were actively cut off, because those would most likely become the actual targets, not necessarily your specific business.
Makes sense. The other one's actually closely related to that, so nice lead-in. It has to do with local resources. It says, what local resources can we tap to help us develop our plan, and are law enforcement agencies good resources?
Yes, they absolutely are. So one of the things that I've noticed in actually delivering a lot of these talks is that law enforcement and local towns and communities are all looking at this same stuff. So if you share with them, your concerns, often they've already done a lot of the legwork for you that they're more than willing, to share back with you. For example, the Red Cross offers a lot of free programs and services for both homes and also business to become more prepared, things like, emergency kits, run books, things for different kind of scenarios. Also, if you have available within your community the resources to do actual tabletop exercises for disasters that could apply to you, that would also be great.
Okay, good stuff. Thank you. Those are the two that we have for right now. Real quick, before I turn it back over to Christian for the second leg, just wanted to remind everybody that you will get a copy. We've gotten a few questions just about this, and I want to clarify. You will get a copy of this slide deck in our follow-up email to everyone. And we're recording this today, and we will post a link to the video so that you can go back to this at any time and also share it with your colleagues. Christian, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks. Okay, so moving away from terrorism into computers and technology, looking at virtualization as a threat. I'm sure a very small percentage, few of you guys have really sat, and thought about, well, all the good work that we did to actually cut server sprawl and to solidify everything is really a threat and high risk. And what happens, from this, as I'm sure a few of you, have actually, hidden under your desk when you've been told that you have no more resources, and if you provision one more virtual machine, everything is going to crash. And if that hasn't happened to you, I encourage all of you immediately after this call to go and check your environment to make sure that you're still maintaining an N+1 status. Virtualization density is the example of this, which leads to oversaturation. So what happens is really saw this 4 or 5 years ago when there was that big IT push to specifically consolidate servers down from that big server room into 3 or 4, really powerful hosts. The sell was, look, instead of having to be psychic when you try and buy a new server, having to think 3 to 5 years out into the future to think, well, if the spend that I'm going to spend today, is this going to meet the needs now and in the future? You would just say, look, we're going to spend some money, not as much money. We're just going to buy a smaller subset of really beefy servers, and then these servers are going to run everything. Then what happens is then that cell becomes, this almost kind of, magic environment, if you will, where you have this huge, pool of resources. It's, highly available because you have multiple hosts. Then what happens is you start to spin up more and more virtual machines, more and more VMs, and you have multiple departments, because basically your requirement to the local business is to be able to turn around resources quickly. And then what happens is a lot of times this gets significantly overlooked in almost everybody's DR plan. So again, this is just a recap on how this became a risk. So that whole cost of build versus buy, eliminate large, CapEx, it's more under your control, external versus internal, and everybody wants that on-demand everything. They want it now. They don't want to wait. That's the whole point of you having VMs, is so you can spin things up. And it also gives you high portability for each one of those virtual machines because you can easily move it around, which creates risk, oversaturation. So this huge mess that's on this poor car here is what a lot of your physical host servers look like, is that you have a large volume of virtual machines, you have high compute workloads, and this also scales over to DR as well. So what happens is when you extend locally beyond the N+1 standards, you end up with a DR site that might not be appropriately sized. One of the things that a lot of organizations do in order to save money is they will take, their old production environments, off-shift them to DR, and then get new infrastructure for production, and then that continues to scale, grow, but the DR end of things is not scaling. Which brings us into, as I like to call them, the big C's. These are major, concerns that a lot of businesses, specifically the IT organizations inside of them, have. Certification and compliance. We're actually seeing a lot of these types of requests for companies that prior weren't necessarily driven by compliance because they see the value of, the audits, the checklists, the best practices. So more and more companies, for example, are actually looking at, PCI, FedRAMP, NIST as sort of the gold standard to follow. Complexity is still a big problem for a lot of organizations. Obviously, capacity, right? That scaling beyond N+1 and not having the ability to grow. And then obviously customer confidence. This is probably one of the top drivers for an improvement around cloud DR, is that more businesses are worried about external perception than even the localized environment. And then of course cost. Almost everybody that I speak to's IT budgets have been drastically cut, yet the expectation is there for a lower, RTO. So how do you handle that? So this brings us into some traditional challenges. Existing infrastructure can become, complex, because I'm sure what all of you do is you have plenty of hours in a day to spend on documentation, because everybody loves documentation. And each and every time you change something in a production environment, you're also, of course, taking the time to update it in your DR document. No, you're not. People don't have time for that. So what happens is then you're pushed to actually take a smaller subset of your environment and not necessarily be able to do a full DR test, because you have to spend most of the time pre-testing to ensure that all the software, all the drivers, all the run books, everything is kept up to date, which then means that your recovery test often fails. And then obviously that's going to then sprawl into needing more time from IT that has already been, cut, but still has that expectation to help with their part of the disaster recovery, as well as ensure that the actual business is running. So the goal from this is to try and minimize the actual testing gap. So you really want to have as minimal as possible time between events in which you're able to test, and then obviously, of course, try to test more of the environment than just a small subset. So from virtualization brings us into that single point of failure. You have now your local environment. You've been able to cut server sprawl, so you've got everything on a handful of hosts. This becomes that, target that often leads to oversaturation, which is obviously risk, and the whole point of DR is, to either mitigate or ideally eliminate risk. Impending disaster represented by the fox. This could be storm, flood, fire, worm, virus, hackers, distributed denial of service. The more you host internally, the bigger target you paint and the more attractive it becomes for folks outside of the organization. Next, my favorite question to ask is, are you recoverable? This is often the, as I like to call it, deer in headlights moment for a lot of IT managers, is that they'll often speak about, well, I have my tapes, I have my backup, I'm offsite replicated, I have my data in, multiple places, I'm good. True, but are you able to recover the data? You may have all that data offsite, but how are you going to get it back, and what are you going to put it into? Also, for a lot of sites and businesses that are driven by compliance, they often tend to overlook, as I like to call them, the building blocks of an environment, such as power, network, security. Security is a big one. I've seen a lot of organizations that are bound by compliancy, and then you look at their actual DR site, and their DR site's not certified, and that obviously creates more risk. And if you're still on tape, tape serves a purpose, but when was the last time you actively tested? How are these tapes being stored? If you're sending them off-site with a specific carrier, in the event of an actual disaster that involves more than just you, how long is it going to take you to get all that data back? Do you already have these other environments spun up? With more and more people having the ability, to work from home, how about the actual firewalls, right? That falls under security. Are all the firewall rules being synchronized? Are the remote access servers synchronized, and set up? Active Directory, so on and so forth. All of the components that allow the remote users to work, have they been thought of? Also, from a specific testing standpoint, specific software, specific applications may work fine locally, but obviously when extended out to DR from a IT services standpoint, everything may work fine, but who owns the application when it goes to actually boot up and then folks aren't specifically able to log in? Things like that are important for folks to look at. So how do you fix everything? Hybrid IT, as I like to refer to it, as you can see here, front and center is the network. This is the number one item that is drastically overlooked when most folks, put together a DR plan. Often the connectivity, the circuits and what have you will be included to allow data replication, to allow backup, things like that, but won't necessarily allow you to run everything as a whole. So you have to find that way to bridge the gap between your internal site and cloud. Also, you run into situations that I'm sure all of you have, where you have that server that not necessarily can be virtualized, that you're afraid to patch or actually reboot, because if you do, the thing might not come back. So you need a way to, be able to connect those physical assets into your cloud as well as your local data center as well. So for those of you that are very familiar with virtualization, you sort of look at these benefits and you see that a lot of these are the same benefits of actually virtualizing, and the same apply to mitigating risk for DR when utilizing cloud. The ability to near instant provision things allows you a shorter recovery point objective and a shorter recovery time objective to actually get your data back. So when evaluating, providers, it's important that you know that you have a home in which you can spin up all of your data, as well as ensure that the firewalls, the computing, so on and so forth has all been taken care of. How simple is simple? So as you can see here, a picture's worth 1,000 words. Your traditional recovery, you have to source hardware, assuming that you have spare hardware. Unfortunately, time affects all things, so your production server is going to age as the same rate as your storage server. One could specifically argue that the storage server is not being used, but if it's not, then at time of test everything's going to have to be built, provisioned, install the operating system. Things are going to have to be patched, and then you can begin your recovery. So on average, you're looking at around plus 40 hours worth of time just for a single environment. Obviously, when things are virtualized, they're significantly easier because that virtual asset is now 100% portable, which means it's going to be hardware agnostic, and you can pretty much spin it up on almost anything. Obviously, in terms of maintaining the user experience, you're going to want to make sure, of course, that you have a, if not like for like, but in terms of disk I/O and compute, that things are going to be relatively comparable. And it allows you to then have a standardized recovery process where you're not spending time worrying about cobbling, together a hardware network solution, but that you have a cloud in which you can run your data on, which is really what everybody's trying to move toward. Top 8 DR plan mistakes. So from the hundreds and hundreds of meetings, calls, and engagements that I've been involved on, I pulled some of these nuggets out to share with you guys today. What happens is that you have a set RTO and RPO back to the business of say for example 4 hours. So that's basically what the actual business hangs its hat on. Then you go to test, and you're not able to test the whole thing. You're only testing a small subset. Then you run into this RPA, your recovery point achievable, that significantly misses. So it's important to look at that test and figure out what went wrong and what you need to fix it. Second one that could almost be at the top is having a backup but not being able to become recoverable. So you have your data, whether it's local on tapes that sit right next to the production server, or if you actually take those tapes or disks off-site, or even if you're at the point where you're replicating data off-site, which is great, but you don't have a plan in place in order to get that data back. If you have more than a couple terabytes, quote unquote, backed up to the cloud, and your thought is when you have a disaster, you're just going to basically pull that data down, make sure you know how long that's going to take, because obviously your environment has to be hydrated up to the point in which you can restore data, which obviously means you're going to become heavily dependent on connectivity and, of course, depending upon the actual disaster, that might not be an option. Single point solutions for protection. So I call these the Ron Popeil style set it and forget it of DR. These are those, magic boxes that snapshot backup, offsite replicate, so on and so forth, that you hang your hat on and try to get into a one-size-fits-all. For certain environments, those are great. For most environments, those are not, because since the last, I would say 3 or 4 years, even a little bit longer, if you look at most environments, it's hard to find an environment that has the exact same RTO and RPO. Most environments have things that are more in flux. So it's important to be able to, have a solution that is going to scale, and more importantly is also going to, fit within budget. A lot of people, unfortunately, are still pushing off cloud because cloud is a horribly vague word. It means so many different things to so many different people. So it's important when speaking about cloud that you understand what the other person's, actively talking about. So for what we're really focusing on today, we're looking at, the 3 main types of cloud: software as a service, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and understanding who provides what within that, specific context, especially as it, surrounds security and compliance. Here's another one. Assuming, well, this stuff won't happen to me, the terrorism, natural disasters won't have an impact. For those of you that tried to order servers and hard drives a few years ago, remember the tsunami that occurred where Sony and Hitachi and a lot of organizations had that flood. And what happened with that is there was a mass shortage of hard drives. So even though, that specific disaster, that specific event happened, far, far away, it still caused us, significant setbacks, especially for those folks that assumed that if they needed hardware, they would just, be able, to actually go to the store and buy it. But everybody had to wait. Again, looking at routes in and out of your area, even though you directly may not be a target, you could become a target of a different attack by cutting off resources to your localized, area, whether it be, food, water, so on and so forth, as previously discussed. Lack of security, both, physical and also virtual, ensuring that your security extends beyond the firewall. So many people nowadays also hang their security hat on the fact, that their workstations have, antivirus and they have a firewall. They're not doing any kind of scanning, log review, IPS, IDS, so on and so forth. And then, of course, there's the humans, right? What do we do with them? Where do they go? Who's going to manage the actual process? How's the business going to run? So these are things hopefully, that have already been thought out, but again, things that are overlooked. A lot of folks are starting to see inside of their DR plans a simplified checkbox, that just basically says, well, if there's an event, folks are going to work from home. So that assumes that you have an environment in which, they actively know how to use. They've actively, tested with it, so that all of the applications, all the system dependencies, so on and so forth are going to work. So those are important things to think of. How can you fix things? So it wouldn't be fair for me to throw out a bunch of problems without solutions, because I was always taught if you're going to complain about something, provide some ways to fix it. So here's things that you can do today for pretty much a zero cost. So look at your environment and confirm that the RTOs and RPOs are appropriate. Look at it by each individual department, each individual application, and then look at all the system dependencies. What is, hanging on the next app? How are things going to continue to work in unison? and make sure that you're including everything that you need in order to run your business. If you're feeling that the plan that you have is 100%, have somebody else look at it and have them try to actually find things missing, because I guarantee you there's always going to be something that you miss, which is then moves us into our next point: shorten up your testing gap. So obviously virtualization, is going to significantly help with this, because it's going to give you that online sandbox, if you will, that is going to allow you to test more of your environment more frequently. And then you're going to also want to test your backups more frequently and then actually commit to your test. If you schedule a test, run the test. Make sure that you have as much pre-work done and you have solutions that are in place to make sure that you're going to be able to hit your RPO and RTOs. Some other things you can do: recheck flood zones and building structures for protection. So obviously, as we saw today, VBIEDs are a real threat. The oversimplification of assembling these devices and the call for more lone wolf attacks, especially here in the United States, it's important that you reevaluate your security perimeter to ensure that you have the appropriate standoff distances for that type of attack, as well as storm surge, snowfall, ice, extended power outages, things like having extended food supplies on hand at the actual business, things that a lot of folks don't necessarily think of. If you have staff that has to be there at the business, make sure that they have what they need in order to sustain and support themselves as well as the actual business. And then obviously take some time to understand cloud, understand what cloud can and can't do, because obviously it's not a one-size-fits-all, especially from a security and compliancy standpoint. You may have some solutions that are more appropriate to be backed up. Other solutions may be more appropriately replicated, things like that. Spend the time understanding what the different types of cloud are and understand how to work within those actual frameworks. Next, you want to, yes, I'm actually saying this, argue for improved policies and standards. We're not, talking about creating policy to hold things up or to create problems, but one of the nice things about standards is that they're exactly that. They become standards. So if you put time into their development, you'll be able, to understand and see holes and know how to sort of move things forward within the organization. All right, you guys, that is my presentation for today. I thank you all for attending. And this is also our second question period. So again, if you have questions, please type them into your question window, and I'll be more than happy to address them.
And we do have a few. I'm going to start with one. I'm scrolling here because we got a few from
Great.
Lee. And I'm sorry to call you out, Lee, but I want to make sure that we address this and that we've understood it. We're kind of paraphrasing your question here. So please use your chat feature and let us know if we're getting it wrong. Hopefully we're getting it right, though. So the question is, can you speak to critical personnel? And I'm assuming that Lee means people in the audience today. Critical personnel who travel frequently and need to be prepared either while they're on the road or when they're getting back to their new home, to their new safe site, and what things they might need to do.
Sure. Excellent question. So first and foremost, if you are traveling and you have a need for secure housing, I would obviously sort of refer you guys to my, co-hosts today at Continuity Housing. They can, certainly help, put you into a place that is going to be available for you. In addition, obviously, before traveling, always check, travel advisories, whether it be, State Department, so on and so forth, to ensure that you're appropriately prepared. Also, the number one tip that I could give, everybody, especially when traveling abroad, don't let your, creature of habit stuff follow you overseas. Basically always, change up your route. Don't do the same thing at the same time each day. And, have really good, situational awareness. Know what's going on around you at all times. That even goes, for folks at home, especially if you're in one of those, soft target, spots.
Okay, that makes sense. All right, we have another, and thanks for the plug, by the way.
Sure.
We have another question. It says, a large portion of the presentation falls under business continuity versus disaster recovery. How do you define the differences when you're talking about DR, which is normally an IT responsibility, taking over actions that should belong to business continuity professionals?
Excellent question and point. That's actually been brought up in my live talk a few times, and the reason I kind of incorporated everything together is what I've been seeing a lot of is there's sort of more of a blurred line now between roles, of where you don't necessarily have specific dedicated individuals that do one or the other. Also now, especially with cloud and a lot of the business, process people, is they're starting to work more hand in hand with IT to ensure that the user experience is going, to appropriately transfer back and forth. Okay,
thank you. This one, and I think this speaks probably to your picture that you shared earlier about the hotel with Google Earth. With technologies such as Google Earth available, what are some things that civilians can do to help protect or at least prepare their communities? And then she puts in parentheses, aside from emergency kits and go bags.
Right, exactly. So one of the great things about Google Earth is you can look at roads, you can look at transportation. So I encourage all of you to look at and to find at least 2 different ways out of your house and also off your road, street, and specific community, right? You want to make sure that in the event of any kind of event that you have multiple ways in and out of your community. And then also think of ways where say for example the highway was shut down, and if that's basically your main go-to, what specific back roads might be available, and then also what's going to be available on foot. And then in terms of the kits and the actual go bags, have more than one kit. So for example, you're going to spend a lot of your time at work, have a kit at work. Have something in your car, have something at home. Have a pre-designated meeting place for your family, because you can't always rely on phones to work. So have, just like you do for your business, have, for your family, a multi-tiered DR plan that ensures that, folks know where to go and who to contact in the event something happens.
Very good. Thank you. Okay, we are at time now, so if we didn't get to your question, Christian will be following up with those individually and via email. We've got your email address from your registration. So, as we wrap up here, I just wanted to thank everybody for attending and ask that you please complete the survey that's going to pop up in a moment. It'll only take you about 40 seconds to finish it, but doing that really helps us provide you with even more productive and instructive webinars in this series. Please also let us know how Continuity Housing can improve your existing plan by providing guaranteed housing for your critical personnel when you need it. For Christian Lappin at TierPoint, Dr. Ed Goldberg and Alyssa at the Association of Contingency Planners, and for Continuity Housing, I'm Michelle Lowther. Thanks again, everyone, and have a wonderful week.